Hello everyone, and welcome to the Cultural Hour on Mountain Stream TV. My name is Thomas Crowe, and I'm here this morning with my co-host Kelsey O'Donnell. And our special guest this morning for this morning's show is Brent Martin, who is from Macon County and is a poet, among other many things. And so I'm going to introduce you to Brent Martin. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I'm glad I could make it down here today from Cowee.
From Cowee. Brent's from the Cowee community over in Macon County, and there's a whole show there that we could have. But for now, we'll try to stick to the cultural aspect of Brent's interests in life. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you made your way up into the mountains and where you originally are from. I know that you've been writing for a long time. I knew that you were teaching some before you got into environmental conservation work, but where did the writing start for you, and what is your path up here to the mountains?
I grew up in Cobb County, which is now basically Metro Atlanta, but at the time was a very rural part of Metro Atlanta. It was really rural. There were forests, and my family had been in that part of Cobb County since the 1850s, so I had a deep connection to that place. Mm-hmm. And then, I can remember as a child, my father driving me down to 285 before it was built, and my father telling me that this big superhighway was about to be built around the city of Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And we lived nearby about 2 miles away, and it was just all wooded. It was just, I could go out in the woods and get lost for hours. It was very different than things now, where your parents then would say, get out of the house and don't come home until dark. And now it's like, can I get out of the house, and how long can I get out of the house for? So my imagination was able to flourish in that environment, and it gave me a very strong sense of place and how important place was in a person's life. So I was, as a young person, really attracted to the nature writers of that period, like Everett Abbey. I remember as a teenager discovering Desert Solitaire for the first time, reading Desert Solitaire, and reading Barry Lopez, and reading Annie Dillard, and reading Peter Matheson, and all the great writers that we know today are just sort of like the giants of nature writing. It was happenstance for me to discover those people. I never had anyone in my family who was into nature. They were just, they were country people really who just grew up, you grew up like everyone who grew up back then. You canned food, and you had a big garden, and all that was just sort of normal, whereas now I feel like with a lot of people moving here, it's become more of a new cultural thing. It's like a different type of back to the land ethic or something that's happening here. But so that was my introduction to writing. It was all just my own discoveries, and then as I got into college and took courses on writing and took Southern history and Southern literature, I got really into Southern literature, and then just discovering poetry as I got older. And I had a really good poetry professor and undergraduate, a poet by the name of Don Russ, who just really kind of gave me a lot of confidence as a writer. He after the class encouraged me to continue writing poetry and submitting poetry. And so I would continue to meet with him, even though I didn't have a class with him. He and I would meet and talk about poetry and writing, and I would show him what I was writing, and he, really pushed me to submit. And so I guess when I was in my late 20s, I got a poem published in the Chattahoochee Review, and I thought that was a major coup. And it's a great journal. And then I went to graduate school, and like a lot of people, graduate school just kind of runs you. It's like, it's just like academics. You're just like, that's what you do. You're reading. You've got more to read than you can read ever, possibly in a week, and you're overloaded with coursework, and there's no time for the creativity. Yeah. And so the creative writing just kind of went the way of, I guess, a lot of what happens to a lot of people in the academic world. They get into that world, and I think it can have a toll on your creativity. So I went to work after graduate school for an organization called Georgia Forest Watch, and there were other organizations sort of in between that. But I started working in the North Georgia mountains for a conservation group, and I was always reading and writing and scribbling poems and thinking about things, but never serious about submitting or publishing. Just trying to have a living and make a go of it in rural North Georgia. And then I got a job offer to move to Western North Carolina to work for the Land Trust of Little Tennessee. And this was a fortuitous moment, but I went to Brevard College for a Wilderness Chautauqua, I think is what it was called. And it was a group of about 20 or so people. I don't even remember how I was invited to that.
Me either.
Because I didn't know you then. But Margaret Brown invited me to that, who wrote the book Wild East. And so I met Thomas at this Chautauqua.
Yeah.
And we became friends, and I had him over one night for dinner with Nan, his partner, and I just showed Thomas some poems because I knew Thomas was a writer.
Yeah.
And Thomas read them. He was like, "Well, you need to be submitting these poems." And so I thought, well, yeah, I know, I should be submitting these poems. I should just start back trying to get published, And so Thomas later, maybe a few months later, he said, well, I've got New Native Press, and I think we should do a chapbook of these poems. And so Thomas really, in a lot of ways, reignited my writing passion.
Yeah.
And I think, just meeting Thomas really did, in a lot of ways, just get me down the road to more publishing and other things. So that's probably, I guess, a short answer. Probably too long to be a short answer, but it's sort of short.
No, it's too short to be a short answer.
Okay, all right.
or something.
Right.
But no, that's a good story, and there's, like you said, there's a lot more detail that you could fill in, and we could talk for a long time about that journey from Georgia and boyhood and up the mountains and then into these mountains. So, by the way, the title of the book of Brent's that finally became a book, the chapbook that he alluded to, is called Poems from Snow Hill Road, and they're place-based poems, a lot of them based in the Cowee community. It's who did the artwork again?
His name is Rob Cox.
Rob Cox, right?
Rob, I've done 3 chapbooks now of poetry, and not including the one that we worked on together, Every Breath Sings Mountains, but Rob did the artwork for every one of them, and every other small press thought that his work was really appropriate for my poetry, so I was able to incorporate his artwork into the other 2 chapbooks too.
Yeah.
I think he did a good job. It sort of fits the content as much as do.
Yeah, no, I love this one, the one that we did with New Native. That was a great experience, and I met Rob at some point.
Yeah, you probably met him when we did the Within the Lines exhibit at
Right.
Handmade in America.
Right. So now you've got 2 or 3 books under your belt, and I understand that you're working on a book of essays you've been writing and are pretty much almost finished with that. And rumor has it that you're even working on a novel, and that I'm very interested in the novel, as you and I have discussed before. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about, tell us about the novel.
Well, I think it all really, in a lot of ways, began with this poetry collection, because the part of Cowee Valley that I live in is a really rural valley. It's got a lot of history. It's a 370-acre National Historic District, biggest National Historic District west of Asheville, and it's really rich in cultural history. Cowee was a Middletown Cherokee capital. It was the Wall Street for the Middletown Cherokees. It's where everyone doing business with the Cherokees went.
Yeah.
So it's got this big Cherokee past. Had one of the biggest African American populations west of Asheville. So there's a big African American population in Cowee Valley. And then there's this other Anglo settler culture that is really also rich. So, and then you add the natural history and the beauty of the place, and it's just layer upon layer upon layer of interesting history and cultural things to draw from. So, after moving to Cowee Valley, my wife and I first lived in Burningtown. We moved to Macon County, which was sublime. It was a fantastic place. But when we decided we were here to stay, we located our search down to, narrowed it to Cowee Valley, Burningtown, and Tellico Valley. 3 just beautiful, stereotypical western North Carolina mountain valleys. Just beautiful old homes everywhere, and lots of interesting old buildings, structures. So we finally found this old farmhouse in Cowee Valley. It was the Doc Clark house. It was the original farmhouse up in that part of Cowee Valley, Matlock Creek, where we are. And all my neighbors, the old timers who were still around there, would give me stories about the place. And there was one man who just consistently came out, no matter who I was talking to, someone would talk to me and tell me about this man named Eskimo Howell. I thought there was no way that anyone with the name Eskimo didn't have some kind of crazy rich life. And so Eskimo Howell, he just kept coming up and kept coming up and kept coming up. He was an African-American man named Eskimo. And so he was a very interesting character. He lived at the end of the road that I live on now. And he ran a brothel back in the woods there. He had a gambling hall, bootleg whiskey business. He was a slumlord. He was everything that, to me, African Americans in Southern Appalachia were not supposed to be. He kind of blew apart, I think, the traditional kind of narrative you have about African Americans left here after the Civil War largely and moved off to cities and tried to find work somewhere or places where they could buy land. All my history of this valley that I've done a lot of research on the African American community there. White people in Cowee Valley sold land to African Americans. It was a really interesting thing to watch. There is to see unfold in the timeline of things. But Eskimo acquired several hundred acres in Matlock Creek, so he's a big landowner, and he's just infinitely interesting. Some local boys tried to hang him when he was a teenager, so people who knew him, who are still alive, and there are a few people still alive who knew him, his closest neighbor still alive, said he had a huge scar from where they tried to hang him out on Shepherd Creek from when he was a teenager. So, the more I got stories about him, the more interesting it started to become. And so I think Thomas might have been the first one, and my wife just said, there's a novel here in this guy. And I put the idea off. I wrote some poems about him, and I wrote a nonfiction piece about him, which was really just a lot of the history of the valley and history of his life and how it fit into the overall history of the valley. His grandfather was a AME minister who moved to Cowee in 1870 and started the first AME church in that part of the state. That church is still standing. And Eskimo is probably the biggest sinner who ever lived before ever getting his religion at the end there. But I just started putting all these pieces together in my own, I fictionalized his life and came up with an idea that has produced about 5 chapters so far. And if I were to really focus on it, I could probably, finish it in a year or so. But how life takes you in all directions.
I do, but it's a fascinating story. I think it's got great potential, so I hope you will continue to pursue that as a possibility.
Oh yeah, it's not going away.
Yeah.
It's too much of it's like an infection or something. I just it's like permanently there. I was like, I'm going to have to. The only way to get the infection cured is to, finish the book.
Yeah.
Did you bring one of the Eskimo poems with you? Are they?
I did. There's a Eskimo poem in this first one. I want to read something about Eskimo.
Yeah.
These are. This isn't to me. I feel like this poem could use a lot of work still, but like all poems, I feel like you could just work on them forever. This is called "The Attempted Lynching of Eskimo Howell." Well, these 2 white boys showed up drunk and dragged me out back past Weaver Zach's house, that big mulberry tree over there, and stood me on a hickory round. It took both of them to kick it out from under me, them drunk and stumbling, on liquor most likely come from one of my own stills. I'd have hung till dead if Hessie hadn't been heading out back to the outhouse. She yelled, Mattie Pearl come running, held me up while Hessie cut me down with a butcher knife. White folks said I must have done 'em wrong, but wrong was my business, and right was something white folks, best I could tell, just like to talk about. I wear these scars here like a necklace the devil himself would have been proud of. I had to lay in bed for days before I figured that out. That was just sort of my own rendering, just based on what people did tell me about him, because supposedly one of the young men did have to do some prison time for it.
Really?
And one of them got away somehow, just, no telling. But it's hard to believe a white person was ever convicted of trying to lynch a black person in the South at that period. And I've never been able to find any court records on it. I looked and looked. I even had an intern one summer, just kind of volunteer sometimes to help me scour the local newspaper archives on it. And I could never find a reference to it. So it's all still kind of mysterious to me, that period, you know.
Well, there's been a lot of talk this week about Emmett Till and that lynching and the whole court case and the people involved, and somebody's just written a new book on it where he's interviewed the woman that testified in court that he molested her, but now she says he didn't. So I mean, there's all that crazy stuff. But
so probably never know the truth about all that, but I can fictionalize it.
In your fictional version, are you taking using the voice of Eskimo, like the poem?
Yeah.
So it's a first person narrative.
It's a first person narrative.
Yeah.
Except I mix up the first person narratives, so I've got different chapters with different first person narratives. So one of the, Eskimo, of course, is a pretty prominent first person narrative throughout it, but I have chapters where there was one particular woman, and this is straight from the historical record because I did find court records dealing with these two. The main woman who actually worked as a prostitute for him, she was a woman named Jane Burkford, and so I wrote part of the novel, one or two of the chapters, as just first person her and her experience, going to that place to work, and the men that would come there, because a lot of people did go there. And a lot of them are probably still alive. And so I tried to write like Jane might have thought as a African American in that particular situation, which is a real, I've read a lot of interesting, I guess you would call them debates about, a white guy like me trying to write as a black person from this period, which, it's a cultural stretch, of course. All I can do is try to be as historically accurate as any creative writer would try to be in this situation. So there is a certain amount of, to me, fear writing a book like this, because you want to make sure you get it right, and you're not taking liberties with things that could be culturally sensitive.
Right, and there's always backlash. You're always going to get backlash from somebody saying, how come a white guy is writing in the voice of a black person? But I think it would be a very interesting book if all the different characters that you incorporate into the storyline had their own voice.
Yeah.
That to me would be very interesting.
Well, and the other chapter is a first person narrative from a sheriff who.
There you go. Yeah.
It's writing part of it, and he's a pretty degenerate sheriff. And so that's another piece of it all.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you're already headed in that direction. Then I mean, giving everybody a first person voice, and I think that would be very interesting.
Oh, it'll get done.
Yeah.
I'm slow. I really am.
Yeah. Well, you're not slow with your writing, because you've got at least 3 books now. You've got another manuscript that's ready that is basically comprised of of pieces you've written for newspapers and magazines. I've got one here that was fairly recently in the Silver Herald. It's a story, fire damage to forest still unknown, about, if my memory serves me right, last summer was a lot of forest fires here in the mountains, and you addressed that issue along with your work as head of the Wilderness Society's Southern Appalachian office. So, how for you does the environmental work and the conservation work dovetail with the writing, or how is there anything?
Well, it does more with the nonfiction than it does the poetry, because in a lot of ways the poetry kind of was a way to not do conservation. You know, I mean, I've always loved nature and studied nature, but the environmental work, you know, I'm wearing a Canary Coalition shirt right now, so I know that Alvin Friedman knows what I'm talking about, and Thomas as well. But like, you know, it can be really demanding. It's a very different way of having to get up and think every day, and in a lot of ways, it, you know, didn't do anything for my creativity, but took away. So writing poetry was more come home and try to just completely disassociate from the work and really just focus on something totally different.
Yeah.
Even if it was just sitting down, stream of consciousness writing to get my mind liberated from the day's work. But the nonfiction, it has definitely informed the nonfiction tremendously. Because a lot of the essays that I've written have been, you know, on tangentially or either directly environmental subjects, or just place-based, you know, and just observations, and living in a place where you're kind of intimate with. You know? So, you know, it's hard to say that the environmental work, you know, you can't help but wonder when you do try to creative write if you had, you know, if I'd gone for an English degree instead of a history degree, you know, or I had majored in botany instead of history, or, you know, would my creative life be different? Would I had more to draw from? But I don't know, because I mean, I'm not working in the conservation world right now. I've been gone a couple of months from it, and so it's like rediscovery. It's like, okay, so what can I do now to really liberate my mind from that enslavement of fighting these day-to-day battles for so long? You know, when you're suddenly free from that world, it's a big world, you know. And we're facing greater environmental threats than ever in this country right now. But it does take a toll on you, I think. I think to try and do a conservation job as the way they need to be done, you're not going to have a whole lot of time left for yourself most days.
Yeah.
So that was a challenge, and creative writing was a way to really have an alternative life.
Right. Well, and Kelsey is a biology major, and so I could ask Kelsey the same question, I suppose. Do you have anything that you could add, or in terms of your experience, in terms of writing or being creative, and your work with biology in the natural world?
Yeah. If anything, especially this past year, I've really started to combine them. Not as much in my writing, but in my photography, and doing. I was working in a biology lab back in this dark corner of the biology building and working with shrimp and doing all this stuff. But then I was also taking super macro photos of them underwater and then creating these images and blowing them up and using them in my photo class for my documentary studies work that I also do. And so all of a sudden I used the same photo in my photo presentation as I did in my lab report, which was like a cool sort of being able to use it for both, and being inspired in that way. Every time I hike, if I see an interesting species or interesting looking species, I take a photo of it just because I want to go look about it or something like that, or just appreciating the morphology or something like that. So in that sense, I feel like it really does affect me. But you mentioned Annie Dillard, who's my favorite author, and sort of reading her more, and starting to, and when I write, you know, I always, if I go on like a long backpacking trip, a long camping trip, I'm always writing. That's always something that I bring with me to do, because it's peaceful, and being in nature, I feel like is the area where I feel most able to write, because I'm not distracted by everything else, and I can just think of the words I want to put on the page. So in that sense, it definitely affects my writing.
Right.
Art.
Where are you going? Do you see yourself going with a major, maybe an advanced degree in biology?
Yeah, I want to get my PhD in zoology, so a little bit study of animals instead of general biology. But yeah, become Dr. Kelsey. It's very exciting.
Good luck with that. I never quite got there. I tried really hard. I gave it a good 5-year run.
Yeah. Well, the unfortunate thing about, well, not necessarily unfortunate, but in this day and age in the science field, if you don't have a PhD, they're like, who are you?
Right.
Who's this schmuck? Like, okay, cool. You
Yep,
got
yep.
undergraduate degree in biology,
Yep,
just
I
like
know.
everybody else.
Yep. Get in
So-
line. Baristas are always being hired in Nashville.
Yeah.
So
So.
you got to keep going in the direction.
So yeah, that's definitely part of it. But also looking at the jobs that I want to do. Everybody has a PhD, and so looking at that sort of thing as well. I sort of need a PhD for what I want to do, and I also actually might want to become a professor later on. So, and I really need a PhD.
Well, good luck with all of that.
Thank you.
We'll be anxious to hear of your progress and where all that leads. So.
I've only got 7 more years of school left.
Wish I could say that real fast.
So, we did the we did the New Native Press book, Poems from Snow Hill Road. But then you kept writing poetry, and what was the next publication for you?
This little book here, A Shout in the Woods, which is another, I love this painting by Rob's. It's, anyway, it's a sycamore leaf with just light blasting through it while it's disintegrating in the fall, probably. But that was the title of the book, is A Shout in the Woods, which is another poem from the collection. It was just a little press. I can't even remember where this press is, but it was just one of those little small presses that I sent a manuscript to, and took it.
What is the focus here? I mean, if the Poems from Snow Hill Road was a Cowie community focus, is this similar, or
Well, this is like how we continued. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
This is the same thing. So I could read a poem.
Yeah, please, yeah.
So I'll read this.
Pick one.
I won't give you all the wrong impressions of me, but this poem is called "Walking to the Hampton Farm with a Bad Hangover on a Cold January Day." So this actually made it into some anthology, like, I don't know, some southern anthology. But here's the poem. No longer willing to ask the why of last night, I thought it best to come out here and die a little among these blue-black shadows and slanted light. The guts of winter are busted rough upon these worn potato fields and corn stubble. The odor could make a buzzard weep. Brush Creek sings its lonesome dream of the Pleistocene. An ice-smothered bluff sweeps snow melt in slow and steady moans. The wind is caving my mouth in, and my tongue is so crossed with last night's wine that it could be the boot-trodden splinters of these shattered ladder-back chairs, or this stinking and drab liquor-stained Davenport. Faded floral wallpaper crawls towards rotten floorboards. Afternoon claws its way back upstream, pushing dusk deep into my fading bones, which long for something which must walk. So this old Hampton farm was a beautiful old mountain farm down the Needmore tract. And when I first moved to Macon County, the old Hampton farm, it was owned by Duke Power before they bought the Needmore tract. And this old farm was about a half mile back in the woods. But my wife and I used to walk to it, and take a bottle of wine and sit out on the porch. And this is about a serious, like, really walking out there with a bad hangover one cold January day. And then the state, decided to bulldoze it, because they bulldozed a lot of those old structures down there after Duke Energy sold it to them. And so all these old farmhouses that were just sitting out there after Duke had acquired all that land to make another hydroelectric dam down that part of the valley, those old farmhouses, the state didn't want the liability, so they just bulldozed them and burned them up.
Yeah.
I had to watch the old Hampton farm go down.
Uh,
But anyway, this is kind of that type of poem,
yeah,
I guess.
yeah. You got another one in there?
Sure, come up with something in here. This poem, there's a guy that lives on the Little Tennessee River who's given me a lot of poems. I say given them to me. I met him when I first moved to Franklin, and he is this sort of archetypal character. He lives on the river. He's this crusty old guy who runs a fish camp on the Little Tennessee, and I don't know. He's just left me voicemails that were just like, I just got to write all that down and make something out of it. He's just like this really crusty person who my wife and I just started calling him the ferryman in this sort of metaphorical way several years back, and we had several poems published that you're just literally like spit out of his mouth or something, or just it was so obviously a poem that I just had to get something down. But this is the first one I ever wrote about him, and it's just called Ferryman. He could care less whether you get across the river, about your Buddhist metaphors, or the great vehicle. Pay him, for he cares if you pay him, and he will get you down the river as far as you care to go. The journey always begins at the same place, and you will choose your destination. What happens in between are stories he has heard so many times in so many different ways that they have become as unintelligible as the cries of wild birds blowing across windy, empty sky. In the old story, Vasudeva listened to the river and was deeply peaceful. He dwelt and shone in all things. He knew that everything came back. Here it doesn't stand a chance. Like I said, he's really the anti-ferryman more than he is the ferryman. But he's a great guy, Vietnam vet, had a really tough time and very ornery and cantankerous, but just seeing him put all these people on the river all the time and sending them down the river in boats, has given me a lot of images and talking to him about his customers. I don't know, he's that kind of guy.
Well, sometimes the stories behind the poems are just as interesting as the poems themselves.
Yeah.
I like hearing you talk about these poems and what inspired them and what went into them. So
yeah, the poems, just never appear to me. I just feel like I take a lot of notes and just scribble a lot, and then I kind of do that as a process. I just keep a poetry journal, which is like 90% garbage, and then I take a highlighter when it's completely full, which may be that thick, and I'll just take a highlighter and highlight what I think is worth anything out of it, and then I rewrite all that down again on something, and then see if any of that stuff fits together anyway.
wow.
I don't know. It's the only process I can make work for me.
Well,
Sometimes. So.
It's like they say, whatever works, and it's different for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I have a friend who gets up at 5 in the morning and does poetry push-ups.
Yeah. Seems like that's something I could never do.
Me either. But it works for him.
Yeah.
And I think he probably throws away 3/4 of what he writes, but he gets a quarter of those poems and
Sure.
keeps them and works on them, and they become something that he keeps or publishes. So
Yeah. I think practice probably evolves over time.
Mhm.
It just changes as you go through the life of a writer. Maybe. Anyway, that's it for that. Lots more in here.
So is the third book any different from the first two books?
No.
That was my next question.
No, it's not. It's not really.
That's okay.
Yeah, I really like the art
Yeah.
because the publisher, this little press in Minnesota, Redbird Chapbooks, they really like to work. They like to pair their writers up with an artist,
Mm.
and they usually will find an artist for you. Really. They keep artists sort of like around, like interns or something.
Mhm.
So when I sent them a manuscript, I put a note in there with it. I said, I really would like to use the same artist who I've done these other two collections with. And they could have just said, no, we always use our own artists or interns or whatever. But I sent them Rob's art, and they were like, that's perfect. We'll just use that art. So, they put this incredible watercolored image that extends to both sides.
Yeah.
They used his art throughout it. Several of his paintings are within the actual text of the book. And
Oh, wow.
they just make beautiful books. They did these little nonfiction chapbooks. They did this little nonfiction chapbook that I didn't submit any art with, and they said, we'll do this one. And so I sent them a bunch of old historic maps. And so when they sent me the proof, I didn't know what to expect, but they had put this old topographic map in the center of it.
Oh, wow.
You open up to the middle of the book, and here's this Cowee.
You can get a close-up.
Yeah, this is a 1904 map, I think, of Cowee Valley. And so, once again, this is the third collection of Cowee poetry, or this is actually a nonfiction collection about Cowee Valley. But they felt like this old topographic map of Cowee Valley would be like the perfect kind of centerpiece to the book, and that was their idea, and it was really creative. And they used a modern topographical map for one of the essays I wrote on the Snowbird Mountains, which of course isn't Cowee, but they used a 1764 British cartographer's map of Cowee Valley in here. That was just, when I saw this in here, I was so happy because I use this map all the time when I give presentations and talks to groups in a PowerPoint. It's high res.
Straight up to the camera.
It's like a 1764. Thomas Mant was a cartographer in the French and Indian War when Cowee Valley was burned and destroyed. Cherokees were completely obliterated. They were not completely obliterated, but their military strength was just never the same after that. But they just do these kinds of. They just do really creative chapbooks. If you look at their website, Redbird Chapbooks, I think it is, redbirdchapbooks.com, you'll see that they just put together these beautiful chapbooks.
Yeah.
And this was the last. That's been 3 years. Like I said, I'm really slow.
Oh,
So
not that long, boy. Time flies, huh?
Probably like every 3 years is kind of what I'm on right now.
Yeah.
So maybe something will happen this year.
Well, that's not a bad run.
It's not too bad.
If you can put something
You're
out
not ever going to get rich that way, but you're never going to get rich writing poetry anyway.
No, I don't think so. But read us one from.
Yeah, I'll do something out of this. Maybe I'll stick with a similar theme. This is a poem called "Retiring the Woodpile," which is about an old metaphorical friend of mine who, if you can't figure it out, I wouldn't tell you, so you're not confused by it. Some people are, but I'll drive around western North Carolina or the North Georgia mountains, and there are these old, like these mortuary shops, right? And there are just these statues out there of angels and Buddhas and unicorns or whatever,
Yeah.
And so I'm driving by this mortuary shop in Blairsville, Georgia, probably over 30 years ago. I see this, you usually see the happy, jolly Buddhas, that's the standard kind of Western image of the Buddha, right? And here was this really gaunt, ascetic, concrete Buddha. That's the Buddha. That's my Buddha right there. I don't care anything about this happy, jolly Buddha. That's not the world. So,
It's not.
yeah. So I bought this thing over 30 years ago, and I can't tell you how many times I've moved and just carried this heavy Buddha around with me. Everywhere I go, it's lived on my porch, it's lived in my garden, it's lived by my, and it's been living by my woodpile for the last decade or so. So it's been several winters ago, this poem, I was out splitting wood, and there he was. So I wrote this poem called "Retiring the Woodpile." Heavy and ascetic, the long dead Buddha sits beside our front porch woodpile in silent resurrection. Eyes closed, oblivious to the dried wren shit staining the folds of his open robe. He is so unmoved by my afternoon activity of climbing, splitting, and stacking that he remains indifferent when my body wearies and my work collapses upon him in sloppy abandon. I'm tired and unenlightened and somewhat unimpressed. I mean, did the Buddha ever split firewood? The old Zen saying goes something like this: how effortless I split wood, how effortless I carry water. But I admit, I would rather become effortless at staring out at the meadow while the goldfinches strip the feeder of sunflower seeds above me, sleeping at last, giving it all a rest.
I'm glad there's somebody else that has a pile of firewood. I thought maybe I was the last remaining person in the world that heated their house with wood.
I
But
wonder how many years I have left in me to do it.
well, that's always a question.
The body can't do that forever.
No, I don't think so, but we do it while we can. And this year was a particularly good wood year for me because they're redoing Old 107 out toward Tuckasegee, and
Supply firewood.
they're gonna widen it and change the routing and everything. So there was firewood laying all over the place, and then they'd love for you to come and get it. So I helped myself, and I've got probably 3 years worth of firewood now.
Well,
So in 3 years we'll have to
recess the body.
Right, recess the body and see if I want to go any further.
I've got neighbors who, they all know I eat with wood, and no one else around me eats with wood. They call me up whenever a tree comes down in their yard. They call me up whenever they have someone coming down and cut trees. And I've just gotten to the point of where it's like, please, no one call me out. Please don't call me with any more firewood. Please don't. Anything but make me go cut firewood today, you know.
Yeah.
But it really is sort of a good mental. I think there is something to that old Buddhist saying, I guess, because it is a meditation in a way to get out and split wood.
Oh, it definitely is.
You know?
We were talking about that earlier. I said it's one of my favorite activities.
Yeah.
Is chopping firewood because it's absolutely the best way to get up my pent-up energy.
It is. Like you work out every frustration.
Stress or anger. If you're angry at anybody, just
Kidding.
go chop wood for like 5 minutes.
Every
You'll
one of
be
those
fine.
rounds becomes someone's head. It's just.
Moving right along. So,
Don't say anything too incriminating.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I won't say whose head. Doesn't matter. It could be anyone's. Could have just been someone who almost hit me in the parking lot of Walmart.
Yeah, exactly.
can you find a little selection in the nonfiction book that you can share with us, since you do write in multiple genres? It'd be fun, maybe just to hear a section or a paragraph or a short passage, whatever.
Yeah. Either that, or you want me to stick with Cowie, maybe?
Whatever you think you'd like to read is
Okay.
fine.
So this is a essay I wrote about. I've written a lot about William Bartram, who was someone else who traveled through western North Carolina, and almost everything we have as far as like cultural depictions of the Cherokees from the 1700s. Bartram provided us with those. And he was only here a few weeks in western North Carolina, but his impact was lasting.
Yeah.
So I have always been kind of obsessed with William Bartram, and so I've written a lot about Bartram. And, this was an essay that I had written. It was actually first published in a little journal called Kudzu Quarterly. But the press took this. Redbird took this one also. I'll read. It's just sort of about a group I took. I've taken a lot of groups out to Cowie Mound, where the Cherokees now own their previous diplomatic capital, which is a pretty cool story in itself. Okay, so this is toward the end of the essay about what it's like to live in Cowie today. Regardless, to live here today in Cowie is to live among the ghosts of previous inhabitants and the abundant relics of their civilization. The mound lies within the heart of the Cowie National Historic District, and at 370 acres it is the largest in western North Carolina. Within a 7-mile reach of the Little Tennessee River as it flows through Cowie are 13 Native American fish weirs. The weirs are constructed of stone and are V-shaped, large, and hidden in many places from centuries of sedimentation and weather that have left them discernible only during times of drought. I spent one hot summer afternoon dragging a canoe through this 7-mile stretch with Lamar Marshall poling along carefully as he mapped each one and assigned it a GPS point. Fish biologist Dr. William McClarney tells me that the weirs were likely used to capture red horse, a large anadromous fish that once populated the Little Tennessee in great numbers before impoundments made their migrations impossible. It is not a far stretch of the imagination to envision a glorious summer day in Cowee as Cherokees gathered in great numbers to run the fish downstream into these structures where they were captured in large wicker baskets as they were funneled through the V's narrow, open end. Today, their numbers greatly reduced, they nonetheless travel the river in thick amber schools, easily spooked as I fish the shoals, but with no local culture to face down each year as their once abundant ancestors did. The vegetation along the river is thick. We push through blackberry brambles, dense river cane, a tangle of invasive exotics, Japanese honeysuckle, multiflora rose, privet, oriental bittersweet, and more. The local wild food expert is extolling the virtue of many of these species and doggedly argues with us as we curse our way through. She tells us we must stop our eradication campaigns and instead learn to live and work with them. It's a tough crowd and no one agrees. Later she gives me the book Invasive Plant Medicine, the ecological benefits and healing abilities of invasives, in hopes of persuading me, but I'm not there yet. I've lived among these species long enough to know that if I left for one growing season, my garden and home would likely disappear under them. Bartram would not approve. We push on, we humans, the most destructive and invasive of species, and emerge onto the old gravel road that was once the main route to Cowee Town and the Mound. Today, the main route through Cowee is a mile away on the opposite side of the river, a paved two-lane known as State Highway 28. Loud Harleys are roaring up the valley, a grim auger's den that grows each year like the privet, a sound that signifies some strange need to dominate, to be seen, to be heard in a world where sound grows and drowns, and silence is something to escape. One more paragraph. As we're departing, a few of us agree to eat lunch at the Cowee convenience store. It is the only store in Cowee, a modern little place with a deli, picnic tables, cheap action film DVDs, and an assortment of camo hats and rebel flag paraphernalia. True to its Cowee roots, it also serves as an ersatz council house, where retired local residents gather in pasty clumps to drink coffee and muse the local affairs. There is a pack of motorcyclists refueling before they continue on their way north, as it is the last outpost for 20 miles. From here, they will turn north and scream down the still wild Little Tennessee River until they reach its impoundment at Lake Fontana, where they will turn up the path Bartram would have taken had he continued on his way to the overhill towns. Their departure is deafening. That's kind of
Very different, but
very different.
so you talked a little bit about your process of writing the poetry. How about your process for when you're writing something like this?
Totally different. I like to write out in longhand, or at least start writing out something in longhand to get the idea. A lot of people can just sit down and write on a computer, and it's real hard for me to just sit down and write on a computer. I wish I could be better at it, and I've tried to get better at it, but I like to sit down and write at least like a rough draft out in longhand.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea might take a while to really gel.
Yeah.
And then I will just start seeing where it takes me. And sometimes I'll stop because it's not taking me anywhere, and I'll sit on it for a long time, sort of like poems. So I've got a poetry collection that's just 2 years old, and I just can't seem to feel good about it.
Yeah.
And so same with the essays. It just seems to sit there until I feel good about it and want to pick it up again. And then once I can finally get a rough draft down that I like, then I'll put it on the computer and really start working on it once I get it on the computer.
Yeah.
But it's just such a totally different process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, I find it the same way. My poetry and prose are two totally different animals. And I approach them totally differently. Yeah.
And not having ever written fiction, that was a totally different experience.
That's another animal. Speaking of animals,
that's been interesting because I had no idea how to write fiction. I had nonfiction writing classes in college, but never fiction.
No, me.
I feel like fiction is, for me, easier to write. I'm good at making up stories, and it's like, there's weird it's hard to write about my real life, I guess. I always found it was harder.
Well, I think there's there are probably a lot. I mean, it's rare. It seems like to see a writer who can move in those worlds so fluidly. That
Yeah.
can go between all of them.
Yeah.
I don't know. Someone like John Lane's a good example of someone who seems like can do it all.
Yeah, he can definitely move between the
Yeah.
between the trees. That's for sure.
Yeah, he can write poetry, he can write nonfiction, he can write a novel.
Yeah.
And I think Ron Rash is probably someone kind of like that.
He's similar. He doesn't write a lot of nonfiction, but
Right.
he
But
can-
poetry and fiction,
Yes.
short stories.
Yeah.
Even like, speaking about Annie Dillard, comparing Pilgrim at Tinker Creek to Maitreys, the Maitreys.
Uh-huh.
Completely different.
Right.
But still, I read the Maitreys first, actually, before I read Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And it was interesting to kind of compare. You could still hear her voice, obviously, but it really was like just two different authors in a
Well,
way.
and I think Janice Ray. I don't know if you've read Janice Ray, but like,
I've not.
yeah, Janice, she's a good poet. She's a really good poet.
Yeah, I think he is.
But everyone knows her for nonfiction.
That's right. I think her poetry's better.
Yeah. And so, but she doesn't write fiction at all that I'm aware of. So,
She may be, but there's nothing published that I've
ever
know of.
seen.
Yeah. But it's all I use the metaphor of writing in place, and you're doing that for real. I mean, all these books are from Cowee, and that Cowee's not a big place either. So
no, and I wonder when I'll run out. I mean, it's gotten harder, not because so much. This new collection I'm working on is called True Stories of the Snow Hill Dead, which is a crazy sounding title, but
no, I like it.
It's like the inhabitants of that place, the ghosts are profound there. There's just a lot of history and a lot of, ugly human history there. With the Cherokee removal and African Americans, enslavement, and I've collected all kinds of crazy stories about Anglo settlers too. So, True Stories of the Snow Hill Dead is kind of a rendering of the past. The present has gotten more difficult because it's a different place. Now there that incredible landscape is with all that incredible history, and there's the incredible plant diversity there, and Cowee Mound, and incredible streams, and rich biodiversity in those streams, and then we have like second homes and political views that I don't always agree with, and
Right.
a lot of them.
Yeah.
And that is a challenge, because you end up being bitter at times about where you're living because you don't have that much of a community there. So you draw from the natural world.
Yeah.
And so the human world doesn't inspire me right now that much, but the natural world does. So as long as I can keep growing plants and observing birds and canoeing the river, and I'll probably keep drawing material from that place. It's a really good question, because there are times when I just want to move. I just get sick of it. And the isolation gets tough, and my wife and I are just sitting out there in February. There's no electricity or something, and I don't want to go hang out with towns too far to get to in the snow. I don't know.
What's the perfect segue into letting you talk a little bit about your work, in terms of environmental conservation, and speaking about the old ways and the old world and the new world, focusing on the here and now. What are your thoughts about Western North Carolina, just to stay in the mountains here, and the state of things environmentally and globally, how the global is affecting the local, and maybe some of the issues that are in the forefront of your mind in terms of all of that?
Well, before I left the Wilderness Society, the big issue for me was getting the new National Forest Management Plan completed here, which in fact affects everyone living in Western North Carolina. It's 1.1 million acres, and depending upon the county, the Forest Service, federal government may own half the county, or like Grand County, 70% of the county. So that entire forest plan is being revised right now. And that's going to affect the way that this landscape is managed for the next 20 years. And I mean, it was an extremely difficult process, and I think there's probably another year left before that process is complete. But I think, what was really interesting to me, and believe me, I've suffered every extreme, I think, including not having a job because of it all, there is to suffer during a forest planning process like that. And I think that forest planning process, it's so vividly illustrated to me the differences between people who have moved here, who live here for particular reasons, and those who live here for other reasons and may be multi-generational, or they might have just moved here last year from wherever. But that conflict between people who see a forest resource like we have here in Western North Carolina as a commodity, and something that should be utilized to get particular objectives like more grouse or more deer or more turkey or more timber or more roads, whatever. There is this polarization in the landscape, and a lot of people in this landscape will never even know that's happening. They read about the forest planning process, some in the news, or they get it wherever on the internet, but they don't see the nitty-gritty kind of dark side of it all the time. And you get this whole new recreational group on this forest, and this forest is like one of the top recreation forests in the nation. It's the second most used forest in America for recreational visitor use.
Pisgah?
The Pisgah Nantahala. Yeah.
Yep.
So
They tell us that all the time. I do a backpacking program, and they always tell us that, it's the most visited.
Absolutely.
Well behaved. Okay.
Yeah, it is. It really is. It's and the only other forest that's higher than this is it's a forest out west. It has a ski resort in it, So the future of this place is kind of, in a lot of ways, or at least the national forest part of this place is being decided right now. For me, that was a big deal. You couple that with some of the other issues we're dealing with and we'll continue to deal with, climate change here in Western North Carolina, the air quality issues the Canary Coalition is working on. We don't know what the future is. I mean, climate variability is what we seem to be up against here in Western North Carolina, extremes. And I think we probably don't know how to prepare for that, and urbanization of this landscape just astounds me. I can just remember moving here in 2003, and I remember coming up to Asheville in the 90s and just like thinking, what a quaint little place, It's just like Asheville is just this explosion right now. It just feels like it's like creeping in here, just like Atlanta crept into North Georgia where I was for years and years. It's like, how is that going to change things here? And how are we going to be prepared to handle that in these more rural parts of the western part of the mountains here? Do we have the willingness, to prepare for it? And that's something I've encountered a lot, and I'm sure groups like the Canary Coalition have, just like, having to fight these counties to kind of get them, to the point of where they can say, yes, change is coming. How do we make sure it doesn't destroy what we love about this place?
One of the things we did out here in Jackson County some years ago when we had a county commissioner's race in the process, we had no land use regulations in Jackson County back then, and the developers were just coming in here. It was almost like the gold rush.
That's the way it was in Macon, where we live.
And of course they could do whatever they wanted, and a lot of what they were doing was trashing our streams because they didn't have any regulations they had to follow about, safety and cleanliness and all that, and they just basically get away with just about anything. But we worked very hard, and we got some people on the county commissioners board who were local, and they wanted to protect the streams and the mountainsides and the mountain tops and all the different issues, building on slopes and all those things. And these guys worked hard, and they came up with the strictest set of land use regulations in the whole state. So it can be done.
It can be done. Jackson County, it was amazing to see that happen.
Yeah, it was almost a miracle. I mean, it really, when you look at all the facts and the history of the county. So Yeah, it's a big issue, the influx of humanity into a small area.
I mean, it's a strange phenomenon because you see everyone's moving here because it's such a beautiful place, and everyone's moving here for quality of life reasons. And yet, the more people who move here, the more that diminishes.
Yeah.
You know?
Do you ever see a sort of disconnect between? I know that Asheville is a very sort of progressive area, and Silva, for what it's worth, is a very progressive small town. But in general, this area tends to be more conservative. Do you find that disconnect between when dealing with highly conservative people? You know, climate change and environmentalism isn't normally a conservative issue, and it's not something they normally agree with. But because they live in this place and it's affecting them, do you see a sort of switch?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. It's like that's always the case, right? Not in my backyard.
Yeah.
Go strip mine West Virginia. I'm not worried about it. I've got, no one's doing that here. But if they were to try to strip mine the national forest here, then they'd probably find politics doesn't matter. Party doesn't matter. I can remember when the Bush administration tried to sell off public lands in the early 2000s. Charles Taylor was in office at the time, and I was working for a land trust then here, and I can remember the Bush administration announcing that all these parcels were going to be for sale, and I think Congressman Taylor co-sponsored the original legislation for it. Taylor, was pushing that whole public lands disposal thing, which a lot of people are afraid is going to happen now with the Trump administration. But I can remember how the Republican commissioners then, one of them in particular, Harold Corbin, kind of, started a Republican outcry against that. And I can remember that's how Taylor was killed with all that, is that the Republicans in this area stood up and said, I can remember Harold Corbin saying something like, Kevin Corbin's father saying something like, my family sold all that land to the government for $3 an acre, and I'll be damned if an out-of-state developer is going to come in here and buy it and develop it for next to nothing, And so I think a lot of, it doesn't matter where you are, I think, on the political spectrum out here. I think everyone really cares a lot about this place.
Yeah.
And I can think of I've only seen a few people. I can remember several years ago at a public, like a community meeting in Cowee, or a monthly community meeting. One of Congressman, it might have been Congressman Schuler's office. I forget who was there. But it was some public lands issue, and there was a guy there who I was standing with talking, and this congressional rep staffer came up, and there was a public lands issue of some sort around there. And I can remember him just saying, I don't think the federal government ought to own any land. And that was sort of like, well, that's a really, really radical opinion. If you think all of this land should be, in private ownership. I'd be willing to bet you that 95% of the people in Western North Carolina, regardless of their politics, don't think that selling off federal Forest Service lands is a good idea.
Yeah.
Everyone cares about that. So, anyway, we could probably just keep right on going. A whole lot of problems.
Yeah, we could make a whole show out of these issues and others, I'm sure, no problem at all, especially with you here, with your history and your knowledge of this subject matter. But we're running out of time, and because of that, we'd like to maybe go out with you, maybe reading another poem.
Sure.
I've selected one out of the poems from Snow Hill Road, mainly because that's the book I know the best, and it's a poem called "The Day We All Stayed Home." Would you be willing to read that?
Sure. Read that.
Because we've been talking about staying home and being home. We've been mostly in the Cowee Valley here this afternoon, and so we'll just kind of re-emphasize the importance of
staying home,
being in place, and knowing where you live, and honoring that knowledge.
I read a great, one of my favorite Terry Tempest Williams quotes of the last several years is, I may have read this in Orion magazine or something, but she said, maybe the most radical thing that anyone can do in America today is stay home. I thought, that kind of says it all. If we all just stayed home, we could do a lot of We could really change things pretty fast if we all decided to stay
Right.
home.
And those people who tend to be troublemakers, if they stayed home, it would be a lot easier on the rest of us.
Right. It's kind of ripple effect. Yeah, this is sort of about being locked in for days without electricity. The day we all stayed home. The day we all stayed home, the ice hung from the power lines and the TVs became as silent as stones. It was very cold, and a few people came out to talk with one another, people I did not know. There was no news, the wrens cried for something lost, and the crows declared loudly that it was all about nothing. A muskrat picked his way across a half-frozen pond, and several small children built a snowman that smiled of a secret yet to be told. My neighbor shaved his beard for the first time in 28 years and built a fire out of old textbooks and last year's tax return. Some claimed to forget things, and when it melted, we were gone.
So our time is melted, and so we are gone. But we want to thank Brent Martin for being with us today,
Thank you.
and
Enjoyed it.
my co-host Kelsey O'Donnell, and Mountain Stream TV. And please join us again next time for another guest. Who knows who it'll be, but you'll have to find out by tuning in the first Friday of every month at 10 o'clock, and we'll see you then.
Thank you.